Hello and welcome to the second of these podcasts on the Miracle of the Week. And this week we're going to be looking at St. Ambrose and the Army of the Dead. And this is going to be the first part of a two-part podcast. This is part one. Just a trigger warning before I go any further, there is an image of there are images of skeletons coming up, so do be warned about those. One of the things that's characteristic about Christianity in the Middle Ages is the veneration of relics, that is, the remains of Christian saints, which are often displayed in churches and which are regarded as holy and as having particular power. The reason for this is that the saints were seen as particularly close to God, and that's where their holiness comes from. And more importantly, their holiness and the power associated with their holiness endured beyond their deaths. The saints, like all Christians who were saved, lived forever. And because they were particularly holy and because they were particularly powerful, the remains of their bodies were seen as sort of places where their holy power continued to be performed. And that's why we have the preservation of relics in Christian churches throughout the Middle Ages. And here on the screen here you can see, for example, the relics of Saint Valentine in Rome. So these saints, when they died, their bodies were regarded as sort of lenses through which holy power was focused. A good example of the thinking of this can be seen in the writings of a 6th century bishop from Gaul, Gregory of Tours, writing about a 4th century bishop and saint from Italy called Eusebius of Vercelli. And Gregory, who writes a lot about the veneration of saints, and we'll be looking at him in later podcasts, says that even though Eusebius of Vercelli was dead and had been dead since the 4th century, he shows that he is still alive after his burial by his current miracles. So miracles were performed at the tomb of Eusebius of Vercelli, and this showed just how great a saint he was. He was living eternal, he was close to God, and even after his burial he continued to work miracles, a sure sign of his sanctity. And this means that the saints' bodies, the relics of the saints that were preserved, were a sort of army of the dead that supported the living in their various endeavours. And a good and early example of this can be seen in the career of the North Italian bishop from the late 4th century, Ambrose of Milan. Ambrose became Bishop of Milan in 374 and was based in a city that was an important centre for the court of the Western emperors in the late 4th century. A number of emperors are based at Milan at various stages when Ambrose is bishop. Now, in addition to that, Ambrose presented himself, as bishops often did, as a champion of true Christian belief, of orthodoxy, against false beliefs, which are called heresy. And many of Ambrose's relations with the imperial court were characterised by confrontations with people that he described as having false beliefs, incorrect beliefs, as being heretics. And in these confrontations, he appealed to the saints to support him. He appealed to this army of the dead to support him in his rivalry with the imperial court. And we have a very good example of this in a confrontation that he has with an empress called Justina. She's the mother of a child emperor called Valentinian II, and Justina was a heretical Christian, and Ambrose pitted himself against her. We have an extraordinary description of what happened in this confrontation from an eyewitness. the famous Christian writer Augustine of Hippo, was based in Milan in the 380s when this confrontation between Ambrose and Justina happened. And he describes how Ambrose called on this army of the dead through his discovery of the bodies of two early Christian martyrs called Gervasius and Protasius. And his discovery of these martyrs was a vindication of the righteousness of Ambrose's position. Augustine tells us that Justina, the mother of this child emperor Valentinian, had been persecuting your servant, Augustine is addressing God here, had been persecuting Ambrose because she was a heretic who had been led astray by the heresy of the Arians. In the midst of this confrontation, Ambrose is said by Augustine to have had a vision in which God revealed to Ambrose where the bodies of the martyrs Protasius and Gervasius lay concealed. Ambrose went to the site that was indicated by God. He dug at the site and he discovered the bodies of these martyrs, Protasius and Gervasius. And Augustine explains that as a consequence of this, as a consequence of the fact that Ambrose demonstrated through his discovery of the relics of these saints that he had the support of God, that as a result of this, the hostile intent of that woman of the Empress Justina, who was confronting him, was at least constrained from the madness of persecution, even if it was not turned in the direction of a healthy form of belief. So she wasn't converted to orthodoxy, but at least her persecution of Ambrose and the true Christians that Ambrose led was driven back. And this is a clear sign of Ambrose's support from God, and that support is shown through his discovery of the relics of these early Christian martyrs, Gervasius and Protasius. And this identification of Ambrose with these martyrs is something that lingered on in the imagination. Augustine tells us the story, but we also have representations of it. For example, in a 5th century mosaic in a church in Milan, we can see at the centre here the representation of Ambrose, and on either side of him are representations of the martyrs Protasius and Gervasius. So Ambrose's association with these saints, which enabled him to defeat the Empress Justina, is something that becomes part of Ambrose's image. And even more than that, Ambrose himself joined this army of the dead because in the crypt of the church in which this mosaic is found, the church of St. Ambrosia, where Ambrose himself is buried, the relics of Ambrose himself are on display in between the relics of Gervasius and Protasius. So Ambrose in death is associated with these saints. Ambrose himself becomes a saint. Ambrose himself joins this army of the dead. And as we'll see in part 2 of this podcast, he himself is able to work miracles long after his death.